So we'll start with just some general trends that we identified in the industry. So in general, the industry is concurrently growing and also undergoing an increasing level of professionalization. So this is marked by better training and opportunities for skills development, better equipment, and an increasing use of technologies. And this is happening particularly in North America and Europe. We also know that PSCs contract out to a variety of clients and take on a wide range of functions. On a global scale, private security outweighs public security in terms of expenditures as well as personnel. And contemporary private security also, while improving, also continues to be viewed as a low-status job in many locales, sometimes even as a last resort for the otherwise unemployed. And working conditions for many personnel continue to remain taxing.
And I will now start by presenting you the 8 main trends. That's how we structured the findings of our research related to working conditions that we identified based on interviews and surveys, as Vincent mentioned before. We think that the 8 trends can basically be categorized in 3 different categories. The first 4 really highlight the main characteristics of working conditions in the industry today. Then trend 5 explores the link between working conditions and personnel's respect for the law. And then the last 3, trend 6 to 8, examine the role different actors can play in improving working conditions. Now, in terms of trend 1, it's important to note, of course, as you all know, that the industry is very heterogeneous, and therefore working conditions differ a lot depending on the geographical context, but also the specific policies of each company. But despite these variations, at least in terms of the challenges, there are some general patterns that we think we can draw from the research. And what stands out probably as the most consequential characteristics of working conditions in the industry today are oftentimes long working hours, relatively low salaries, and potential exposures to health risks. And while these issues have come up in a lot of interviews with managers, guards, civil society organizations across the globe, it's important to note that they are less pronounced in some places like Europe, like North America, because the industry there tends to be better regulated and minimum wage and other labor standards more tightly enforced. And the graph that you can see here underlines this by providing an overview of hours worked in the private security industry by region. And you can see that in Europe, they're much lower than in the rest of the world, kind of underlining the fact that regulation is tighter in Europe than elsewhere. The most important challenges private security personnel face in terms of working conditions are listed on this slide that we identified. Although it's important to note that's not an exhaustive list. There's other issues that are beyond the scope of the research. Perhaps most importantly, again, low wages tend to be prevalent, sometimes without pay for overtime, sick leave, and holidays. Security officers may be paid at minimum wage, but as Eddie mentioned before, in several countries, the relevant minimum wage has been reported as quite low in relation to the cost of living. And also what we saw in some interviews is that some guards were even paid below minimum wage. Then also working hours tend to be very long. In many countries, shift systems of 12 hours are common, and in extreme cases, working hours may even exceed 12 hours. Some interviewees, for instance, in the GCC, also reported that security officers have to work 7 days a week without a day off. And the long working hours are further exacerbated by long hours spent in transportation to reach the workplace in some cases. Then another challenging working condition relates to personnel's deployment to dangerous work environments without adequate protective equipment, of course, very related to the work ICoCA does. One example, which was reported in several interviews, was, depending on the country, of course, a prohibition to carry firearms, despite operating in environments which put guards at risk of armed violence. At the same time, also situations which do not involve armed violence can pose threats to health and safety of private security personnel. For instance, extreme weather and lack of shelter or other site-specific hazards. Then also various contractual shortcomings were reported during the interviews as another challenge, including insufficient social security provisions and contract fraud, including the refusal to pay pensions, which were previously subtracted from salaries, or lack of formal contracts and registration as private security personnel, leaving the affected individuals particularly vulnerable to exploitation because they may not be compensated in cases of injury or laid off without prior notification. One reason for why these problems persist is that was reported by some interviewees, the frequent lack of entities that represent interests of private security personnel, including unions. We heard that if not prohibited, personnel are often discouraged from joining unions. And this was not just confirmed by interviews, but also our survey responses. In our survey, roughly half of respondents said that they were permitted to join a union, while the other half said that they were not. And at the same time, 80% were not represented by a union, although it's important to note here the majority of respondents are working in Europe, where regulation tends to be better than in other places. Now, moving on to trend 2, we thought it was important to specifically focus on labor migration in the private security industry, given the widespread practice of outsourcing security services in conflict-affected countries and the specific vulnerabilities that labor migrants face there, especially in conflict-affected countries in the Middle East, but also elsewhere. Clients often rely on labor migrants because they do not trust the local population with the provision of security services. That was at least reported by respondents from Iraq, Afghanistan. And due to the underlying economic inequalities that encourage labor migration, labor migrants in the private security industry face specific vulnerabilities, which include payment of recruitment fees, which are often exceeding several annual wages in the migrants' countries of origin, leading to debt bondage, which has been classified as a modern form of slavery by the UN. Many labor migrants are also unable to freely change jobs because their passports would be confiscated by the employer. And other prevalent problems are poor contractual protection against injuries. Again, the assigning of more dangerous tasks than stipulated in the contract, and the provision of inaccurate information about working conditions in the destination country before departure. Now, some of these issues represent indicators of forced labor as defined by the ILO, and reportedly, in the case of Malaysia, the ILO identified that the poor working conditions of private security personnel from Nepal exhibited all 11 indicators of forced labor, which of course is explicitly prohibited under international law, but also in the code, as you know. Then Anne will continue with trend 3.
Perfect. So the third trend that we identified was that working conditions are heavily influenced by gender and racial or nationality-based inequalities, among other discriminatory bases as well. So of those survey respondents who identified that they had witnessed or experienced discrimination in the field, They noted nationality, discrimination on the basis of nationality at the highest rate. This was followed by gender, race, sexual orientation, and religion. We also know that white men are often in leadership positions in private security. The industry is on its face quite racially diverse and diverse based on nationality. However, we found that the diversity tends to be siloed. So it's not actually present throughout the entire chain of command of most PSCs. So this suggests a couple things. One, that there are still structural barriers for minorities entering the field, and two, that opportunities for meaningful participation are stymied by some of these pervasive power asymmetries that continue to persist in the field. We also found that many private security personnel working in conflict zones or in complex operating environments, particularly in the Middle East, are recruited from developing nations. And Paul talked a lot about some of the concerns that labor migrants face and some of those challenges. Those are also fueled by underlying economic and racial inequalities and are certainly interconnected to a pretty significant extent. So gender diversity in and of itself is relatively nascent in the field and somewhat minimal, particularly when compared to racial diversity or diversity on the basis of nationality. So about 18% of our survey respondents were female. This is somewhat reflected in, this is from ILO's synopsis of the private security industry. It's based on about 82 countries, so it's somewhat limited, but our findings support that as well. And while the share of female personnel in the industry is growing, women reported that they continue to be at risk of gender-based violence, sexual exploitation and abuse, and harassment. And that was reiterated both in our survey and throughout interviews, and has also been reported in other literature as well regarding the private security industry. So interviews also confirmed the difficulty of hiring women in Iraq and in Gulf Coast countries. Some interviewees mentioned pervasive cultural factors as a barrier. Others talked about stereotypes that might inhibit the recruitment of women as well. And one interviewee noted that while they value gender diversity, it's also important to consider that you need to prioritize the safety of personnel as well. So we certainly don't want to overlook that safety should be at the center of this conversation. However, also finding ways to manage it instead of excluding it entirely. So existing practices surrounding gender diversity are extremely important and certainly represent massive progress within the industry itself. There is, of course, always room for improvement. We identified that current practices can cyclically reinforce inequalities and underlying gender dynamics that gender diversity itself is intended to disrupt. So first, gender is often talked about in terms of a binary in the industry. And there are at times a lack of genuine risk assessment conducted by both clients and companies to actually accurately assess personnel risk by gender identity. So this could include, for example, assuming that female personnel are unfit for deployment. This, of course, limits the extent to which companies and clients can accurately capture some of these challenges that gender diverse personnel might face and then accurately respond to those challenges. These then also are likely to contribute to assumptions surrounding inherent benefits that women might bring to the field. We found that these assumptions are often rooted in stereotypical ideas about skills women might have or justifying why women are good for the field. So this included, for example, assumptions that women are always good at conflict resolution. Some interviews talked about their cordial attitudes or their quote unquote calming presence within the industry. So it's certainly important to not limit or pre-assign the contributions that female personnel can bring forward, particularly because it tends to create expectations that don't always deliver and also can foster myopic narratives of female personnel in the field. We also found that this framing can tend to actually encourage that women are placed in stereotypical roles. So this includes administration often, and we see very, very few women in leadership positions. And that again was reiterated throughout many of our interviews. So all of these tendencies together, again, might actually reinforce regressive gender dynamics, which then creates risks not only for personnel, but also for civilians. So in terms of shifting that, we want to ensure that we're not catalyzing the same harm that we sometimes see by reinforcing these gender dynamics. Risk assessments should genuinely track the harm and then responding accordingly. We also found that where diverse personnel are hired in the industry, and this goes for race, on the basis of nationality, and on the basis of gender, where these personnel are hired is just as important as whether they are hired at all. So providing personnel for opportunities for growth within the company is important, and creating opportunities for meaningful participation in the sector where diverse identities are actually included at the decision-making table is important. The next trend we identified is that personnel often have limited training, and that better training will require not only more hours invested, but also some substantive shifts in the material that personnel receive. So interviewees time and again emphasized the value in training, and that was something that we saw consistently across essentially every interview that we conducted. While training has improved in quality, which again is an important progress in the industry, that has been somewhat uneven in terms of whether it's actually implemented, in which locales it's implemented, and is quite variable by company. For our survey, for those that carried arms at work, actually only 82% had received any weapons training for carrying those arms. We also asked personnel to identify the areas of training they believed were needed the most for private security personnel to perform their job. So de-escalation and emergency response was reported the most. Self-defense also came up quite often, and then the use of force and weapons. Human rights was also listed. Of course, however, all of these have impacts on not only personnel safety, but also the way that personnel are able to interact with civilians, and can handle complex operating environments. So training centered around these areas can help prevent negligent behavior and mitigate risk to personnel and civilians. Some of these measures we also found might be beneficial in actually preventing the prosecution of personnel themselves. So one interviewee in Latin America, for instance, noted that personnel are often detained for excessive use of force. However, that is related to a lack of training and often falls on the companies and the clients themselves to provide personnel with those substantive skills. So there is certainly a knowledge gap in that can catalyze mistakes within the industry that have a massive impact on personnel, on clients, on the reputation and trust in the private security industry at large. Pragmatically, robust support for some of these initiatives is very beneficial, and particularly as private security personnel take on public-facing roles at increasing levels, interact with civilians, some of these more social service-oriented roles are very important. So we recommend that all personnel should be trained both by PSCs and supplemental training by clients. In circumstances where PSCs might be short on resources, we also identify the need for clients to provide base training in those cases. And that not only the amount of time of training needs to be increased, but also the material needs to be increased, of course, by people who have experience in the field. Something else we heard particularly in the North American context, is that often those who are training don't always actually have the practical experience to be qualified to conducting that training.
Now, as I mentioned in the beginning, in Trend 5, we look at the evidence for establishing a link between poor working conditions and private security personnel's respect for the law. First, we found that guards who are treated poorly and paid little are more likely to steal or accept briberies, something which was reported by quite a number of interviewees. At the same time, we also heard of situations in which guards were ordered by their companies or clients to break the law. For instance, one case that was shared with us was that of labor migrants being ordered by their employers to beat up misbehaving colleagues. Another interviewee described a case in which private security personnel working for companies with close ties to a government was ordered to support the police in controlling protests, likely using excessive force. And these situations were reported as difficult to address for personnel who may have limited awareness of their rights or limited access to reporting mechanisms. Second, there's also evidence that poor training, especially on the use of force, may lead to violations of the public's rights by guards using excessive force. Interviewees directly involved in private security work reported that relevant training they started to implement actually reduced the number of incidents in which excessive force was used. And beyond these two patterns that we identified, and relevant to ICoCA's work and the code, we can also argue that some of the working conditions of guards may themselves infringe upon private security personnel's rights under domestic labor law and international human rights law. For instance, in cases of forced labor of labor migrants, or companies withholding salaries or underpaying their personnel. And not just our interviews, but also survey results confirm the aforementioned findings and point to wider implications of poor working conditions for the health of private security personnel. The vast majority, with over 90% of respondents, stated that poor working conditions may cause mental and physical health issues, while over 60% believe that private security personnel are more likely to engage in unlawful behavior as a result of poor working conditions. Another 83% stated that this may decrease the quality of their security services.
So we'll look at Latin America as an example of tracking this relationship that we found between working conditions and compliance with human rights norms and standards. The consequences are certainly not specific to this one context, nor are potential adherence issues that might arise in instances of poor working conditions. But first, in this context, there are monitoring and enforcement problems. So there's often limited capacity of many government bodies. We've heard time and again from interviewees that government officials are sometimes bribed. Personnel are also often armed in Latin America. That is not uncommon. However, they usually have limited training and oversight. They're underpaid, they're overworked, etc., as Paul has averse to. It also, in some locales, is quite a high-risk environment and shares ties to organized crime. So all of this operates in tandem and can actually increase levels of instability. So this can contribute to violence, and it often risks undermining human rights and harms both personnel and the civilians that they are interacting with. So the next trend we identified is that governments themselves play a huge role in setting standards that ensure decent working conditions. Interviewees again emphasize that governments play not only a role, but have a large responsibility and an obligation to oversee the private security industry and in setting these standards for personnel. So they remarked on the importance and value of legal regulations to improve working conditions. One interviewee emphasized the need for meaningful instead of redundant legislation. And some interviewees noted that a lot of the existing legislation fails to focus on the well-being of private security personnel. In many countries, too, we found that there are some unregistered personnel who then lack adequate protection under the law, which puts these individuals in particular especially at risk of facing poor working conditions. Current regulation of the industry by government bodies is generally fragmented. That is not true everywhere, but we see that typically on some level, and it tends to be quite inconsistent. So this certainly could complexify oversight and make it easier for companies to undercut each other in some contexts. Sometimes we also found that governments might not have the political capacity to carry out or implement regulation despite having the political will to do so. So for this case, we'll look at North America. Again, this is not unique to North America, but it does provide an important case study. So first, within the context of North America, there's often a lot of variation and inconsistency of standards for companies that are operating within Canada and within the United States. So interviewees mentioned some of the concerns with that in terms of inconsistency in pay, job titles, and training. There is a national minimum wage in both the United States and Canada. However, the federal minimum wage is certainly not a living wage. And for states, individual states or provinces that don't choose to go beyond that, personnel are severely at risk are severely vulnerable to poverty. Often, too, for companies that operate transnationally, they may default to domestic law. That is not inherently in and of itself negative. However, we found that when they are operating in contexts where domestic law is not as strong as the law in the home country, that personnel face quite pervasive working conditions. So we recommend collaboration certainly between local and then the national government. Collaboration between different state governments is also really important and is not something that we see quite often. And this would be particularly relevant in cases where companies are operating transnationally and we have some consistency between host and home governments. So more regional agreements are important and international agreements as well. There's some rudimentary research that indicates that states that endorse the Montreux document will see an increased chance of PMSCs, for example, complying with international norms and standards. So that, of course, while preliminary, does indicate that there is an importance for both regional agreements and international agreements. Governments should play an important role in setting base standards and certainly include those with experience in the field in the decision-making process. We did hear that oftentimes these individuals are excluded from the decision-making process and are not given a seat at the table in setting standards. Collaborating with CSOs and with other organizations that represent workers' rights is also really important. There is a lot of emerging work on the role that CSOs and NGOs play in governance standards. So governments can certainly leverage this contemporary landscape to support their own efforts in setting and maintaining standards for personnel.
Then Trend 7 focuses on the important role of clients in reportedly driving a race to the bottom when it comes to working conditions in the industry. This was reported as a major obstacle, and many of you will have experience with this yourselves. A major obstacle to improving the working conditions of private security personnel. Many company managers actually shared with us that they would be very willing to increase the pay of their workforce, but they would no longer have the chance to win any contracts if they did. Now, being cautious of time, I think I will not go into too much detail here, so we can move on soon with the panel discussion. I just want to highlight that there have also been a number of very good practices shared with us of clients providing training for hired private security personnel themselves, conducting due diligence before signing contracts, and explicitly requiring from companies to implement certain working conditions. But again, that differs very much from case to case. And we can discuss also this further in the consultation session. Certainly be very interested to hear more from you about your experience in this regard. Then Trend 8, the last trend. There we discuss the role of ICoCA in improving working conditions, for instance, by developing relevant training and guidance. This observation is based on some of the existing activities of ICoCA, but also some potential ideas on what ICoCA could do in the future. And again, that's also something we want to focus on during the consultation session and hear from you what your ideas are in this regard, what the role of ICoCA can and should be in the future. Now, a few things that ICoCA is already doing. For instance, as discussed before, ICoCA is making a contribution to improving working conditions through the code, including requirements regarding a safe and healthy working environment, the provision of training, and the prohibition of forced labor. ICoCA is also providing advisory services, as you may know, on responsible procurement practices and ESG and human rights due diligence compliance, and raising awareness about the issue through research like this. Now, what else ICoCA could do in the future? Yeah, something we definitely want to discuss with you. There are a few things that we can potentially identify, including relevant trainings, such as on the use of force, something that was reported as lacking in some cases. And additionally, ICoCA could also conduct further research on more regional or thematic trends. Now, we're gonna move to the limitations, and then I'll introduce the consultation session.
So we have certainly identified some quotidian features in the industry. Of course, there are gaps that we'll continue to focus on prior to the publication of the report in early 2023. So our sample size, particularly in Africa and Asia, was relatively small. So this created some geographic disparities that we certainly want to address. And while our context allowed us access to personnel to survey, certainly our contacts affect some of those outcomes, and there may be still inaccessible populations that moving forward we would want to attempt to continue to represent. And then in all, we know it's an extremely variable industry, so all of these applications will be interpreted within the various circumstances that private security operates in.